On the morning of October 13th, 1307, every Templar in France was arrested at the same time, not sequentially, not region by region. Every preceptory, every chapter house, every garrison across the entire country hit simultaneously at dawn by agents who had been carrying sealed orders for weeks and were not permitted to open them until that morning. The coordination required to pull that off in 1307, without telegraph, without telephone, across hundreds of separate locations, was extraordinary. Philip IV of France had been planning it for months. The arrests were precise, the men were taken, the properties were seized, the assets were frozen before anyone outside the operation knew what was happening. Hundreds of knights were in custody by mid-morning. The Templar leadership was taken at the Paris Temple, the order's headquarters in France, and one of the most fortified private buildings in Europe. Inquisitors were already prepared. Philip needed this to look like a religious proceeding, not a theft, so the charges were heresy, idol worship, obscene initiation rites, denial of Christ. The church would handle the prosecution, the crown would handle the assets, except the assets were not there. When Philip's men opened the vaults at the Paris Temple, they found almost nothing. The treasury that was supposed to fund his debts, the wealth of the most powerful financial institution in medieval Europe, had been cleared out. And when investigators reached the port of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast, where the Templar fleet was stationed, the harbour was empty. 18 ships. Gone. They had sailed the night before, on October 12th, with no recorded destination, no manifest that survived, and no arrival port that history has ever been able to confirm. Someone inside the order knew the arrests were coming. The fleet was loaded and gone before the sealed orders were ever opened. The Knights Templar were founded in 1119 as a military order, and for the first 9 years of their existence, they fought almost nobody. That is not a minor detail. This was a military order operating in active Crusader territory, surrounded by conflict, officially tasked with protecting Christian pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. And they did almost none of that. What the historical record shows instead is 9 knights living in quarters given to them by King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, quarters located directly above the ruins of Solomon's Temple on the Temple Mount, and they stayed there. 9 years. Digging. Contemporary chroniclers noticed. Bernard of Clairvaux, who later championed the order and wrote their official rule, could not fully account for this period. The knights had no significant military engagements on record. They had no documented patrol activity. What they did have was exclusive access to the substructure beneath the most sacred site in the ancient world, and they had it for nearly a decade without any outside oversight. When researchers examined the tunnels beneath the Temple Mount in the 19th century, they found evidence of systematic excavation that did not match the original construction of the site. Somebody had been digging methodically, in specific directions, towards specific locations. What they found is where the record goes quiet. When the 9 knights finally emerged and returned to Europe around 1128, everything changed almost immediately. They arrived at the Council of Troyes with no clear military record and left with official papal recognition, an exemption from all taxation, and the authority to operate across every kingdom in Christendom without answering to any local authority. Within a generation, they controlled more land than most monarchies. Within a century, they had invented the modern banking system and were lending money to kings. None of that follows from 9 knights with no army and no documented military victories. Something changed at the Temple Mount. Something they brought back. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared from history in 597 BC when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, and it has not been publicly seen since. What it was, physically, is described in enough detail across multiple sources that historians have a reasonably consistent picture. A chest constructed from acacia wood, roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, covered entirely in gold inside and out. On the lid, 2 gold cherubim facing each other with their wings extended overhead. Inside the chest, the stone tablets bearing the 10 Commandments, a sealed jar of manna from the Israelite Exodus, and the rod of Aaron, the staff that reportedly turned into a serpent before the Pharaoh of Egypt. The biblical texts treat it not as a symbolic container, but as a functional object, something with active properties, something that behaved, and what it reportedly did goes well beyond what any ceremonial religious artifact should be capable of doing. At Jericho, the ark was carried around the city walls 7 times, and the walls collapsed. At the Battle of Aphek, the Israelites brought it to the front lines, and the Philistine army, which had been defeating them, immediately began asking each other which god had arrived. They captured it anyway. Within months, every city in Philistia that housed the ark broke out in tumors and plague. The rats multiplied. People died. After 7 months, the Philistines sent it back on an unmanned cart with gold offerings, desperate to be rid of it. The cart went directly to Israelite territory without being guided. And when it arrived, 70 men in the village of Beth Shemesh looked inside it and died on the spot. The most specific account is the death of a man named Uzzah. The ark was being transported on an ox cart. The cart stumbled, the ark shifted, and Uzzah reached out instinctively to steady it. He touched the side of it with his bare hand. He died instantly. No illness, no delay. The text says God struck him down for the unauthorized contact, and David, who had ordered the transport, was so frightened he refused to bring the ark any further for 3 months. Consider what this amounts to when applied to actual circumstances. An object that kills on physical contact. An object that produces radiation-consistent symptoms in populations exposed to it over time. An object that generates enough electromagnetic discharge to kill a man who grabs it while it is moving. Modern researchers have spent considerable effort on this. The most persistent theory is that the ark functioned as a large-scale capacitor, built from the specific combination of gold, acacia wood, and the dry atmosphere of the Sinai, capable of accumulating and releasing static charge at lethal levels. A second theory proposes radioactive material stored inside the chest, which would account for both the immediate deaths and the plague symptoms that followed prolonged proximity. Ninth, a theory is proven. Both are more coherent than the alternatives. The ark vanishes from the biblical record before the Babylonian invasion. It is not listed among the treasures Nebuchadnezzar carried back to Babylon. No credible account places it in Babylon. It was hidden before the city fell, or removed, and the question of where it went has been generating serious academic debate for centuries. Which brings us to a village in Warwickshire, England, about 8 miles from Stratford-upon-Avon, Temple Herdewike, named for the Templars who built a chapel there after the Third Crusade. The record survives. In 1192, that preceptory housed what the documentation calls objets sacrés, brought back from the Holy Land, and among them, specifically described, a large golden chest. Not a reliquary, not a chalice, a chest. The dimensions recorded in the land survey correspond closely to the biblical specifications for the ark. The Templars spent 9 years digging under the Temple Mount. Whatever they found in those tunnels was significant enough to transform a group of 9 penniless monks into the dominant financial power in Europe within a single generation. Some of what they found probably ended up at Temple Herdewike. Under torture that lasted years, Jacques de Molay confessed to a remarkable number of things, but he never once mentioned what was in the vaults at Temple Herdewike, and he had to have known. There is no historical record of the Knights Templar ever possessing the Holy Grail, and there never was. No inventory from the 1307 arrests mentions it. No confession extracted under torture references it. Not one contemporary document from the Order's entire 200-year existence describes anything resembling a sacred cup in their custody. The Grail connection is not a historical fact that got suppressed. It is a literary invention that got repeated so many times it started to feel like one. The object most people picture when they hear the word Grail, a chalice, a cup, something Christ drank from at the Last Supper, does not appear in the earliest sources at all. The first writer to introduce the Grail into Arthurian legend was a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes, working in the 1180s. In his telling, the Grail is a platter, a serving dish carried in procession through a castle. It feeds everyone present without being refilled, and a knight named Percival sees it and fails to ask the right question about it. That is the whole story. There is no cup. There is no Last Supper connection. There are no Templars. Chrétien died before finishing the poem and never explained what the Grail actually was. Then, in the early 1200s, a German poet named Wolfram von Eschenbach rewrote the story entirely. His version is called Parzival, and in it, the Grail is not a platter and not a cup. It is a stone. A stone with the power to sustain life, to heal wounds, to grant what amounts to conditional immortality to anyone who serves it faithfully. And the people who guard that stone are a brotherhood of warrior monks called the Templars. They are chaste. They are militarized. They fight to protect the Grail from anyone who would take it by force. Wolfram was not subtle about what he was describing. The Templars are the Templars in everything but name. Wolfram then did something that no serious scholar has been able to explain cleanly. He claimed he did not invent any of this. He claimed his source was a man named Quixote of Provence, a poet who allegedly had access to the true account, and that Chrétien de Troyes had simply gotten the details wrong. The problem is that nobody has ever found any evidence that Quixote of Provence existed. No manuscripts, no records, no contemporaries who mention him. Nothing. Either Wolfram was protecting a source he could not safely name, or he invented the source to add credibility to something he had constructed himself. What he constructed, or transmitted, is the question that has not been resolved in 800 years. Because there is a third possibility beyond invention or literary borrowing. The Templars were, by the early 1200s, the wealthiest and most secretive organization in Europe. They had spent years under the Temple Mount. They had access to documents, records, and objects that no one outside the order ever catalogued. The Grail in Wolfram's telling is not a physical relic in the conventional sense. It functions more like a living document, something that selects its own guardians, carries encoded requirements, and cannot simply be taken by force. That description fits a bloodline record, or a set of instructions, better than it fits any cup or stone. What the Templars found beneath Jerusalem, and what Wolfram chose to encode in a German poem about a knight on a quest, may be connected by something that was never meant to be stated plainly. The timing is difficult to dismiss. The Grail legend, in the form that links it to a brotherhood of warrior monks, emerged at the exact peak of Templar influence, when the order was untouchable. It disappeared from serious literary circulation within a generation of the arrests. Whatever Wolfram von Eschenbach knew, or thought he knew, he published it in the early 1200s, while the Templars were still powerful enough to destroy him for it, and he was never touched. The Shroud of Turin was in Constantinople in 1203. It was in France in 1357. Nobody has ever been able to account for the 153 years in between. What the shroud actually is, at the physical level, is this: roughly 14 feet of linen cloth bearing the full body image of a man who has been crucified. The image is a photographic negative, meaning it reads correctly only when the tonal values are reversed, a property that was not even understood until 1898. The wound patterns on the image correspond precisely to crucifixion: nail marks at the wrists rather than the palms, puncture wounds consistent with a crown of thorns, a lance wound between the ribs on the right side. After more than a century of scientific analysis, researchers still cannot agree on how the image was formed or what, exactly, produced it. The Templar connection begins in 1204. That is the year Crusader forces sacked Constantinople, stripping the city of its most sacred holdings. The cloth that Byzantine records identify as the burial shroud of Christ was in Constantinople at least as early as 1203, documented by a French knight named Robert de Clary, who described it on public display at a church in the city. After the sack, Robert de Clary wrote that nobody knew what had become of it. It simply vanished. And then for 153 years, nothing. It reappears in 1357 in the French town of Lirey, in the possession of a knight named Geoffrey de Charny, a man whose family had direct and documented connections to senior figures in the Templar order before its suppression. That gap is what Barbara Fraile spent years trying to close. Fraile is a researcher who works inside the Vatican secret archives. What she found was not the shroud itself, but something almost as significant: Buried inside the trial documents from the Templar suppression were descriptions of initiation ceremonies that the Church had used as evidence of heresy. In those descriptions, new members of the order were brought before a cloth bearing the image of a bearded man and instructed to venerate it. Not a crucifix, not a painted icon, a cloth with a face on it. The testimony came from multiple knights, questioned separately in different countries. The description is consistent enough across witnesses that Frail concluded the Templars had been using the shroud as a ceremonial object for days before the arrests. Some researchers have proposed that the image on the cloth is not Jesus Christ. It is Jacques de Molay. The theory goes like this. After de Molay was arrested in 1307, his interrogators subjected him to a deliberate mockery of the crucifixion, a crown of thorns, wounds consistent with the Passion narrative. He was affixed to a cross without being killed, left long enough to produce the physiological effects: blood, sweat, the full biochemical signature of a man in extremis. Then he was taken down and laid in the shroud while still alive. His blood combined with his sweat. The chemical reaction with the frankincense that linen cloth of that period was routinely treated with produced a contact image that set into the fabric as it dried. The torturers, in other words, manufactured the most sacred Christian relic in existence as an act of punishment. If that reading is correct, the Church has been venerating a portrait of a Templar Grand Master for 700 years, created during his torture, housed in one of the most protected religious sites in the world. The carbon dating puts the cloth in the medieval period. The wound patterns match crucifixion. The man in the image has been beaten and crowned with thorns. The one person in the historical record who fits every one of those details was burned alive on an island in the Seine River in 1314, after years of exactly that kind of treatment. In 2014, two collectors who had spent a decade assembling what they believed was a genuine Templar artifact collection announced their most significant find, a chalice carved from black obsidian that no one could explain. The collection itself was already unusual. Over 100 artifacts sourced across Europe and the Middle East, all traced through provenance chains that pointed back toward the Templar suppression of 1307. A sword bearing 3 Templar crosses, a helmet, a small iron reliquary box, a libation cup. But the Obsidian Chalice was the object that stopped researchers. Obsidian is volcanic glass. It has no place in Catholic sacramental tradition. Every liturgical vessel in Orthodox Christianity, the chalice at Mass, the parton, the ciborium, is made from metal or ceramic. The Church's own regulations going back to the early medieval period specify what materials are acceptable for sacred vessels and why. Volcanic glass is not on that list. It never was. Which means, if this object belonged to the Templars, they were not using it for anything the Church would have recognized as Christian worship. The markings on the surface made the problem worse. Researchers who examined the chalice described a set of symbols carved into the base that matched no known liturgical iconography from the 12th or 13th century. Some of those symbols have tentative parallels in pre-Islamic Arabian ritual objects. Others appear close to markings found on obsidian ritual vessels recovered from pre-Christian sites in Anatolia. None of them are definitively identified. And that ambiguity is the point, because obsidian as a ritual material has a specific history that runs directly counter to everything the Templars were supposed to represent. Across Mesoamerican, Near Eastern, and early Mediterranean cultures, obsidian appears repeatedly in the same context: divination, scrying, and the reading of reflective surfaces as a means of accessing hidden knowledge. The Aztecs used obsidian mirrors. Pre-Christian ritual traditions in the Levant used black reflective stone bowls in ceremonies involving the summoning of knowledge or the dead. If the Templars came back from 2 centuries of digging beneath Jerusalem and excavating across the Holy Land with a black glass cup covered in unidentified symbols, the most straightforward explanation is not that they found a Christian relic. It is that they found something older and kept it. This fits a pattern that runs underneath every section of this story. The Templars were accused during their trials of worshipping Baphomet, conducting ceremonies in sealed chapters, venerating objects that had no connection to the faith they were sworn to defend. The standard dismissal is that those confessions were tortured out of frightened men by an inquisition that had already decided what it wanted to hear. But the Obsidian Chalice does not come from a torture chamber. It comes from a collection. It is a physical object with physical markings and a material composition that has no innocent explanation in a Christian military order's inventory. During the trials, Templar Knights testified to ceremonies that the Church called satanic, involving the veneration of idols and the use of objects with no liturgical purpose, and a black volcanic glass cup used for scrying fits that description far better than anything in a standard medieval Christian inventory. Philip IV of France died in 1314, the same year he had Jacques de Molay burned alive, at the age of 46, from an illness his physicians could not identify. That fact alone would be unremarkable. Kings die. But then you look at what followed. Pope Clement V, who had signed the papal bull sanctioning the suppression of the order, died 7 months after de Molay. Both men. Same year. And before he was executed, standing on a scaffold on an island in the Seine, de Molay had reportedly called both of them by name and summoned them before God within 12 months. The medieval chroniclers who recorded this were not conspiracy theorists. They were court historians documenting what happened. What happened is that both men were dead before the year was out. Philip's sons did not recover what their father had started. Louis X died in 1316 at 27. Philip V died in 1322 at 29. Charles IV died in 1328 at 33. None of them produced a male heir. A dynasty that had held the French throne for 341 years ended in a single generation, in the 14 years immediately following the destruction of the Templars. That is 3 sons, 3 early deaths, no succession. The Capetian line simply stopped. Medieval dynasties ended this way sometimes, but not often, and not this cleanly, and not this fast. The tangible consequences become visible in what followed. The men who conducted the trials, the inquisitors who extracted the confessions, the administrators who inventoried the seized properties, also died in unusual sequence. Not all of them, and not dramatically. But the concentration is enough that French historians writing about this period keep noting it without being able to explain it. The preceptories that passed into new hands after 1307 accumulated a specific kind of history: financial ruin, disputed ownership, buildings that changed hands repeatedly and never stabilized. The properties that the crown had expected to enrich it became administrative burdens within a decade. The temptation here is to call this a curse. That is the wrong frame. The more coherent reading is this: the Templars had spent roughly 2 centuries building something, not just wealth, but a system, financial networks, diplomatic relationships, and, based on everything we have covered in this video, a body of knowledge about specific objects and what those objects required. That knowledge was not written down anywhere the crown could find it. It lived in the order. When the order was destroyed, the knowledge died with it. Philip IV seized the physical objects. He seized the properties. He seized the treasury records. What he could not seize was the understanding of what he had taken and what handling it actually meant. The new owners had everything except the context, and whatever the Templars had been doing with those relics for 200 years, whatever protocols they had developed, whatever precautions they had built around the things they found under the Temple Mount, none of that transferred. The objects went to people who had no idea what they were holding. The last Capetian king died in 1328, 14 years after the suppression, without an heir, closing a dynasty that had ruled France for 341 years, and the objects that had been in Templar custody at the moment of the arrests were scattered to locations that have never been fully mapped. The trial of the Knights Templar produced roughly 231 confessions in France alone, from knights who had never met each other, being questioned separately, and an uncomfortable number of those confessions described the same specific things. Torture was standard procedure. The inquisitors used strappado, sleep deprivation, starvation, fire applied to the feet. Under those conditions, a man will say almost anything. Historians have known this for centuries, and it is the reason the Templar confessions have been largely dismissed as evidence of actual practice. But that dismissal contains a problem. Torture produces compliance. What it does not reliably produce is specific, consistent, unrehearsed detail from men who were isolated from each other and questioned weeks or months apart in different cities. And yet the details match. Not in the vague way that frightened men might agree that yes, something irregular happened at initiations. In the specific way. The threefold veneration. The instruction to deny Christ not once, but 3 times. The cloth with a face on it. These particulars appear in depositions taken in Paris, in Cyprus, in England, in Aragon, from knights who had no possible way to coordinate their answers. The bearded idol called Baphomet is the detail that appears most often. Some knights described it as a severed head mounted on a stand. Others described a face on a flat surface, a cloth or a panel, with no body attached. The word Baphomet itself has never been satisfactorily explained. Neither explanation fully accounts for why the object was described so physically and so consistently across independent testimony. The cloth description is where things stop being comfortable. Multiple knights from separate chapters described being shown a linen with a bearded male face during initiation. They were told to venerate it. They were not told what it was. The connection to the shroud is not a modern invention. Researchers noticed the parallel in the 1970s when the Vatican trial records were more fully analysed. A disembodied bearded head on cloth, venerated in secret during locked ceremonies, matches the shroud as it would appear if the cloth were folded so that only the facial portion was visible. That is exactly how the shroud was displayed in several of its early documented appearances in France. Whether that connection is coincidence or description is the question nobody has been able to close. What makes the senior testimony particularly significant is that the highest-ranking knights had the most to lose by confirming any of it. Lower-ranking members might confess to anything to stop the pain, but the men who had spent 30 or 40 years inside the order, who understood exactly what confirmation meant for themselves and for the order's legacy, those men confirmed the same core set of practices anyway. The senior Templars, the men with decades inside the order, confirmed the same core practices, whether they were being questioned in Paris, or in Cyprus, or in England. And the object that appears most consistently in their descriptions is a disembodied male head that they were required to venerate, which is either an elaborate coincidence or a description of something real that was in the possession of every major Templar chapter in Europe. The 18 ships that left La Rochelle on October 12, 1307, the night before the arrests, have never been accounted for. No port recorded their arrival. No customs document lists their cargo. No harbour master in Portugal, Scotland, or the Eastern Mediterranean wrote down a single word about 18 Templar vessels appearing out of the Atlantic and unloading whatever they were carrying. They left. And then they were simply gone from the historical record, the way objects tend to go when the people who know where they are have every reason to stay silent. The treasury the French crown expected to seize was empty. The Ark of the Covenant has not been located. The Holy Grail, whatever it actually was, has not surfaced. The Baphomet head that appears in 231 separate confessions from knights being questioned in separate rooms in separate countries has never been found as a physical object. The Shroud of Turin is in Turin, locked in a climate-controlled case, available for occasional display, its origins still officially listed as disputed despite the research, the trial testimony, and the very specific 153-year gap in its documented history. The Obsidian Chalice is in private hands. None of it is publicly accounted for. None of it has been verified, catalogued, or surrendered to any institution that would make the full picture available. What has surfaced, consistently, is the pattern. In 1947, a shepherd boy searching for a lost animal in the hills above the Dead Sea found a series of caves containing the most significant manuscript discovery in modern history. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Those caves are in a region the Templars are documented to have used and excavated. Found alongside the scrolls was a document called the Copper Scroll, which is unlike every other scroll in the collection. Where the others are religious texts, the Copper Scroll is a list, an inventory. It describes dozens of locations where vast quantities of treasure were hidden before the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD. Researchers who have cross-referenced the Copper Scroll's location descriptions against Templar excavation records have found overlaps, not coincidental overlaps, specific ones. The Templars were not collecting mythology. They were not building a library of legends or preserving stories for posterity. They were digging in specific places, removing specific objects, and transporting those objects across the Mediterranean under military escort to preceptories in France and England and Cyprus. And they were doing this for nearly 200 years with enough organizational discipline that when the arrests came, nothing that actually mattered was anywhere the French crown could find it. Philip IV destroyed the Knights Templar, executed their leadership, and seized everything they owned, and he died 4 years later, having apparently never found what he was actually looking for.